Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. In the next two episodes, we are going to look at the most experimental, chaotic, and noisy rock music, real out of left field stuff that came out of the 1960s. The 60s, more specifically the second half of that decade, was when rock music really revolutionized and changed in sound. During the psychedelic era, bands were pushing the boundaries of conventional pop music and experimented with sounds and integrated other genres of music, and that really became the norm. However, there were bands that really pushed the boundaries of sonic experiments to the point where the music in some cases was almost unlistenable, or they were creating innovative sound that would take decades for the audience to appreciate. Now, some of this music was made by very adept musicians, and some of it was made by complete amateurs who couldn't really play their instruments. We're going to do this in two episodes. In the first episode, we're going to look at bands that created noise, dissonance. Now, sometimes that was on purpose, sometimes not. And in the second episode, we're going to look at these 1960s rock bands who really integrated electronic sounds into their music in a very innovative way. Now, all of this music was really pushing the boundaries of the time, and this was what we would truly call outsider music. The first band on the list comes from my home country of Canada. It's called the Nihilistic Spasm Band, and they were formed in 1965 in London, Ontario, Canada. The band created kind of like an improvisational music, and it was mostly done on homemade instruments, and some of these were like variations on kazoos. This 8-member band created completely noisy music that is chaotic, discordant, and, lacks any sense of melody. It's kind of like a precursor to no wave. They developed a cult following, especially in Japan, where they were praised by a lot of the Japanese noise artists as being kind of pioneers of that genre. The singing really involved screaming or kind of like reading random poetry. They released one album in the 60s called No Record. This listen is a serious challenge for any music listeners. If you want to hear a sound that is like a precursor to no wave, Einstürzende Neubauten, or half Japanese, this is for you. Through the years, members have passed away or retired, but the group was still making music recently as 2016, which was the year of their latest release, but they released music in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. A documentary about the band called What About Me? The Rise of the Nihilist Spasm Band was released in the year 2000. Again, if you're into noise and chaos, check out the Nihilist Spasm Band.
Start with America!
The next band is another band that created chaos, and they are called the Godz. Now, there was a rock band in the 70s that has the same name. This is not that band. They were based out of New York. Their concept was to create music with total freedom, even if you can't actually play the instruments. Again, the band was based out of New York, and their first album was released in 1966. They have a pretty standard lineup of guitar, bass, drums, but they have things like the auto harp as well. Now, they do sound as if everyone had picked up the instruments for the very first time 5 minutes before the recording started. Now, their first album sounds like a really out-of-tune New York folk rock record. Some of the singing is just absurd. Weird sounds. Now, their second album has a more electronic sound. I believe it's called Godz 2, and there are attempts at melody here, but again, it comes out kind of discordant and odd. There are political tirades, and there's some abrasive acoustic guitar. The sound here is a bit of a precursor to the music of Jandek. The third album, titled Third Testament, came out in 1968 and is more of the same, like strange folk, pure noise, and just overall madness. They were signed to ESP Disc, which was a label that released a lot of free jazz and other experimental groups like Pearls Before Swine, Holy Moldal Rounders, and the Fugs. Their last album was released in 1973 before the band broke up. Now, the Godz really has some of the most extreme sounds associated with the 1960s counterculture. Definitely check them out. Now, a father's dreams for his daughters led to the creation of some serious outsider music, but wasn't really done on purpose. The man was actually a bit of an overbearing tyrant who probably had some serious mental health issues. Austin Wiggin Jr. worked as a mill hand, and he lived in Fremont, New Hampshire. When he was young, his mother read his palm and said he would marry a woman with strawberry blonde hair, he would have 2 sons after she died, and his girls would form a successful music group. Well, when the first 2 things came true, he decided he would get his teenage daughters to be in a rock group in 1965. The members would be Dorothy, or Dot, on vocals and lead guitar, Betty on rhythm guitar and vocals, and Helen on drums, who was a little bit older than the rest of them. Dorothy, or Dot as she was known, again, wrote the songs, and occasionally younger sister Rachel would fill in on bass. Now, the father never let the girls have a normal social life and made them do things like calisthenics and practice. The problem was the girls did not really want to play the music, and they were never given any real music lessons, and in fact, they didn't know how to tune their instruments. They would often pretend that they were practicing when their father was not around, sneak out and stuff like that. When they played live gigs in 1968, people booed them and threw things at them. Their father got them into a studio in Reverie, Massachusetts to record an album in 1969. The girls, who looked miserable, were not ready at all. Again, can't really play the instruments, don't know how to tune them. Now, apparently the staff at the recording studio could not stop laughing when they heard the girls play. The result was the album Philosophy of the World. The girls played these out-of-tune, discordant rhythms, again, not on purpose, in attempts to create a pop song. Now, this is again, a precursor to something like Daniel Johnson or even Wesley Willis. They're trying to play, but it just doesn't sound right. But it is a unique sound, and it's got zero self-consciousness. Bands in the 90s would kind of take this sound again, but they would all be very self-conscious and ironic. There's no irony here. Now, initially, only 100 copies of the album got released, and somehow 900 copies disappeared, and Austin's money was taken apparently by one of the studio employees. However, it might have been the father who refused to release the other copies, scared that the girls' sound would be copied by other musicians. The girls would play together over the next few years, and were even brought into the studio again in 1975, but those recordings were not released at that time. Austin would die of a heart attack that same year, and the band would break up and disappear into obscurity. However, there would be people who found the record and they championed the band. Frank Zappa loved the record and claimed the Shaggs were better than the Beatles. Kurt Cobain put Philosophy of the World on his top 50 list. The members came to terms with the music, and Dot and Betty even recorded an album in 2013 and played a reunion show in 2017. Philosophy of the World by the Shaggs is an amazing example of outsider music.
People want what they're doing, people shove. Halloween, it's time for scares, it's time for squeeze. It's Halloween, it's Halloween.
The next band on the list is Red Krayola from Austin, Texas. This band was involved in the same music scene as the 13th Floor Elevators, and Roky Erickson even guested on their albums. The band was formed by Mayo Thompson and Frederick Barthelme. After going through several members, they would eventually become a three-piece with Steve Cunningham. They released their first album in 1967, Parable of an Arable Land. This album consists of tracks of complete noise, played not only by members of the band, but by 50 other people who were hanging out. They were dubbed the Familiar Ugly. And the noise was not only created by the instruments, but by things like power tools and motorcycle engines. Each of these tracks were called Freeform Freakouts, and they were numbered. So Freeform Freakout number 1, number 2. But in between these tracks were actual songs. But those songs are still avant-garde and experimental. Now, in the sound of these more conventional songs, there's elements of folk, psychedelia, and blues. Thompson sings absurd lyrics that are completely random in structure. Standout tracks include Hurricane Fighter, Transparent Radiation, and Former Reflections, Enduring Doubt. Their follow-up album, Coconut Hotel, consisted in part of 36 one-second long pieces. Their label, United Artists, who was willing to do some experimentation, they just refused to release it. So they did put out another album called God Bless Red Krayola and All Who Sail With It. Bartholomew had left. He actually went on to become a successful author and was replaced by Tommy Smith. The experimentation continues here with a lot of minimalist tracks that sound kind of like early industrial music at times. And at other times, they kind of prefigure the early rhythms done by Can, especially in the Michael Mooney era. The band really challenged the conventions of the pop rock song.
Well enough alone, but try to keep in touch. Don't wander far from home.
They would break up by the end of the decade. But Mayo Thompson would stay active in music. He released solo albums, he put together different incarnations of the band, and he produced albums by The Fall, The Raincoats, Cabaret Voltaire, and James Blood Ulmer, and even for a while joined Pere Ubu. Now, Red Krayola is often name-dropped by indie rock practitioners. These two albums that the band released in the 1960s are very challenging, very ahead of their time. The next band released only one album in 1969, actually called Orgasm. And of course, I'm talking about Chrom Magnon. Put together by members Austin Gasmier and Brian Elliott, the band would go into the studio to create an album that foreshadowed music that would be played like 2 decades later. The opening track has strange percussion, bagpipes, and vocals that, they resemble death or black metal. The next track is just somebody grunting in pain with these odd percussive sounds in the background. There's all kinds of samples throughout this album and sounds that are just random. There's some acoustic guitar in places, but it doesn't have any sense of traditional melody. This really sounds sinister and unnerving at times, like something out of, Eraserhead, but not quite. It's a real nightmare. It's like this nightmare of sound. It predicted things like Nurse with Wound, who actually referenced this band a lot, or Throbbing Gristle, or even like the noise rock you get in the 80s. And anyone who's just used any kind of strange sounds in music, this band was doing it first. This might be the strangest album on this list, which is saying something. Now, if you really are up for a challenge, go back and listen to all of these. It's not easy music, any of this, but it shows you that the underground was really pushing the conventions of rock music in the 60s. Now, in the next episode, we're going to see some of the bands who really did a lot of innovations with electronics in their music, and again, were way ahead of their time. Thank you for watching 20th Century Music and Arts. Please like, share, subscribe, and let me know if you've heard any of these albums. They're definitely worth checking out.